Mark School of Public and International Affairs, and it's delightful to have you here this evening. I have three distinguished guests with us tonight to talk about the mysteries of this election season. We're not talking about politics per se today. We're talking more about mechanics and law. We know that Joe Biden was declared by news organizations on Saturday morning to be the president-elect of the United States. We know, too, that the Trump administration and the Trump campaign have been contesting that result, and they have proposed a series of court actions in what has already been the most litigated election in American history. We want to unpack what has gone well, what might have gone better, what might yet happen during the course of this counting season, as election day has turned into election week, and I dare say is turning into election month. Joining us this evening are three wonderful panelists who will elucidate the answers to these questions for us. If I can just bring up their biographies, my mouse is giving me conniptions this evening. We have with us Roger Bernstein, who is a New York-based attorney with over 40 years of practice in federal and state courts. As an assistant U.S. attorney, he prosecuted white-collar cases and represented the U.S. government in a major Superfund case. He participated in 2000 during in the protracted election dispute between George W. Bush and Al Gore, and brought an absentee ballot case in which several of the fundamental election law issues now before the courts were previewed, and Roger will be sharing those perspectives with us this evening. I'm going to introduce all of our panelists, and then we're going to begin a conversation. I'll say a little bit more in just a moment about how we'll run the evening. Joining us as well is Kathleen Hale, professor of political science at Auburn University, where she directs its election administration initiative and graduate program in election administration, the largest such program in the United States. She teaches courses in election administration, qualitative methods, and intergovernmental relations, and her research examines how to improve the capacity of government and nonprofit organizations to address public problems. Dr. Hale also directs Auburn's partnership with the Election Center of the National Association of Election Officials to professionalize the public administration of elections through its national certification program. Welcome, Kathleen. Great to have you here. And our third panelist this evening is Professor Sonia Jarvis here on the Mark School faculty. Many of you know Sonia, an accomplished attorney and scholar whose research and teaching have focused on race, politics, and the media. As a practicing attorney, her practice focuses on civil rights, civil liberties, and counseling nonprofit organizations and minority business. Particularly relevant to this evening, she is currently co-authoring a book with Nicole Gordon and Don Wiseman entitled States of Confusion: How New Voter ID Requirements Fail Democracy and What to Do About It, under contract with and soon emerging from NYU Press. Welcome, Sonia, and welcome to all three of you. Let me just say a word about logistics this evening for you and for all of our guests who are in the audience tonight. What we will be doing is having a conversation among the four of us early in the evening, and then we will, around at about 6:15 to 6:30, depending on how the conversation goes, welcome your questions, which I invite you to, as early as possible, to post to chat. So I will be reading your questions from chat and posing those to the panelists. Several of you submitted questions prior to this evening's program, and I will get those into the mix as well. So without further ado, we have had, as I mentioned a moment ago, a remarkable election season already. It is the most litigated election in US history to date. We are dealing not only with the fractious politics of the day, but also with COVID-19. And Kathleen, I wonder if I could come to you first and just ask the question, how are we doing? How did this pan out? Did we see the kinds of disruptions that many had expected? And how have we dealt with these twin challenges, to say nothing of the cybersecurity threats domestically and from abroad that also become an important part of this mix?
Yeah, thank you, David. I'm delighted to be here with Sonia and Roger and the audience. I think when we look back at this election, even though it's not quite over yet, perhaps, what we have to say is, wow, in the face of a pandemic, wholesale changes in some states beginning with the primary season in March, new election laws in many states implemented for the first time in 2019 or 2020, changes in voting methods, and the ever-present concerns of cybersecurity that have been with us since 2016, election officials rose to the challenge. They were professional, they were gracious, they worked really, really, really hard. And as you can see from the exceptionally transparent work environment that they all enjoy, you can live stream and watch them now. Counting and doing various sorts of things. And so I think hats off to election officials, hats off to voters. Turnout, record turnout, regardless of your ideology or party affiliation. Hats off. I think we learned a lot. I think we learned a lot about things that we maybe the general public certainly became aware of for the first time, of looking under the hood of election administration, for example. And I think that we have seen, seen great voter interest in new methods of voting. What might have been for them new certainly were expanded options, even where they were already in place. Tremendous interest in voting by mail, whether you call it absentee voting or early in-person drop-off voting. We saw vote centers, we saw early voting days expanded, and I think we can take away from this that election officials are good at their jobs. They did a great job here. Voters were interested and want to vote. And I think that piece of this is a big success story.
Marvelous. And this took place even against the backdrop of resources denied that were requested under the CARES Act and other bills in Congress, as well as negotiations that never eventuated between the Democrats and the administration. The Senate wasn't really participating in this process to try to figure out how to shore up election support even more vigorously, right? Yeah, that's true. That's true. The election funding structure is extremely complicated, and I'll just top line it by saying that the local elections are a local function, and the local function, no matter how you look at it, is somewhere below 1% of the overall local budget, and clearly in great need of charity, because many election jurisdictions have taken advantage of private philanthropy, which we could talk about perhaps later on as a good idea or a bad idea. But the federal government provided money for cybersecurity, which was very welcome. No one would ever say that they didn't want to receive that money. And there was CARES Act money that was out there. I think the biggest perhaps politically neutral thing to say about the election administration funding piece is that it is a tremendously underfunded aspect of public administration to begin with. It was a system under stress before these things happened. And so to the extent that federal appropriations were made available, it was perhaps only with sleight of hand that local jurisdictions were able to use those funds for anything that looked like general operating. Just a very, 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 we asked a starving dog to run faster, and they won. Okay. That's a metaphor that's going to stay with me well beyond this evening. Roger, let me pivot to you next. Everything that Kathleen has said is true, that we've seen the remarkable transparency and literally can click on webcams and look at that remarkable transparency right now. But that's certainly not the way that the Trump campaign and even sitting civil servants in the Trump administration are presenting that picture. And they are arguing vast corruption in the election and have filed a number of suits trying to get courts to either throw out ballots or to sequester ballots or to change, or perhaps to launch entire recounts. Can you say a little bit about what we see right now in the nature of the challenge and how much of this we saw ahead of time, either based upon our experiences in 2000 or what we've learned about the Trump campaign strategy this year?
Okay, well, I have a less sunny view of the legal landscape. We could start there. We had, I think, 140 lawsuits filed in various states prior to the election in which people argued and fought about certain issues, and the issues were resolved in different ways at different times. Some clarity emerged from those lawsuits, but some did not. And some of those lawsuits were filed and litigated after people were already voting. And that creates a tremendous problem, because what happens if the result of the lawsuit is that what people how they voted was unacceptable or illegal or unconstitutional, what happens to their votes? That problem was visible in the year 2000 when I was involved in a case in Florida. And it never goes away because the legal framework is not clear or consistent. And every time it gets to court, there are 2 points of view and one prevails and one doesn't. And sometimes it's at the expense of the people who've already voted. So that's a huge and probably unsolvable problem. The general perspective on the litigation, on the current cases, is one that I share. Namely that you can't just go to court and say fraud, you have to start coming up with genuine evidence, real examples. And the fundamental difficulty that the Trump campaign faces is that even if they can find a problem with a vote here and 10 votes there and 14 votes here, they are not in a position to argue any kind of widespread, fundamentally undermining misconduct. So that's why almost everybody feels that the cases that they're filing now will not result in any change in the election. I have an adverse footnote to that to mention in a moment. But I want to digress for 1 second because this year people saw on television that when demonstrators approached the counting rooms, there was a line of sheriff's deputies or police in front and they stopped any interference with the counting. In Florida, in the year 2000, we had something called the Brooks Brothers riot when people who were nicely dressed stormed up to a counting room and got all the people counting 64,000 votes in Florida to stop counting, and they never resumed. Nobody ever found out whether those 64,000 votes would have made the difference there or not. So we did a little better on election security here this time than 20 years ago. The last thing to be said about the legal framework, legal situation at the moment, is that the Trump lawyers are still trying very hard to develop a case that could be squeezed into the law somehow or another and brought to the fore to disqualify. In Pennsylvania, they're trying to disqualify 2 million votes. I think those efforts are inherently unlikely to succeed, and later on today, I'd be glad to talk about why. But generally speaking, the perspective that the legal world is not going to help the Trump campaign is the correct perspective. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you. And we'll explore other aspects of that as we move through the course of the evening. But first, Sonia, if I could turn to you. One thing that we are seeing is that perceptions of the fairness of the count varies sharply along partisan lines. Upwards of 70% of Republicans believe that the election has been stolen, while upwards of 70% of the general population, including those Republicans, by the way, believe that the election was fairly conducted and that Joe Biden will in fact be the next president of the United States. Can you say a little bit about the partisan divisions here and what this result says about our polarization in this country today?
Thank you, David. And I want to follow both Kathleen and Roger's observations about the uniqueness of what we've seen from this election so far. We had President Trump spend a good part of the primary season alleging that using vote by mail would lead to fraud. And so it's not a surprise that his supporters would think, oh, fraud occurred, and therefore we should not trust the election results. I think that's one thing we can look at. But I think it's the overall partisan divide that you mentioned as set up for this question. When we look at the results across the country to see who actually showed up, and I'm going to be looking forward to Tom Etzel's program next week, I think, to give us more information on how each cohort within the electorate voted. But we know, for example, that young people voted in higher numbers than in 2016, some 8 points. We saw 74 million supporting Joe Biden and 70 million supporting President Trump, which is phenomenal when we think about the fact that we have been suffering through this pandemic. We can also look at the fact that in the primary process, to your point about the distrust, some 400 lawsuits were filed around the country to challenge attempts to make it even easier to vote. Imagine if those types of efforts to suppress the vote had not occurred, we might have even seen higher numbers of people participating in this process. So it's a function not only of what was going on in each state, because each state is responsible for their own electoral process, but it's also the question now that the president has decided not to concede despite the margins in each state. And now we have to go through a process that by some experts are suggesting that we won't have a resolution till January 6th, which is the date that the Electoral College votes are presented to Congress. So that slows down the transition process, which is always difficult, no matter who wins and who loses. We have concerns already about how some of our foreign adversaries may be taking advantage of this unexpected transition process. And to take Roger's point, we can look at a few cases that are outstanding that may cause additional uncertainty. But I'd also like to follow up on a few points that Kathleen mentioned. And that is, I think we really have to thank our poll workers and our election administration officials for the incredible job they did this season. When we had threats of violence, we had, as Roger mentioned, looking back to the 2000 election, where people actually stormed those offices and counting centers and made people extremely afraid. Here we had protection from the police and sheriff departments to make sure that did not happen. And so if we're looking across the nation, I think it's fair to say that the incidence of fraud has been hyped and will not be proven in a court of law, but that does not stop what we can expect from the administration in resisting the truth of what happened last week.
Thank you. I'd like to go to this question. You mentioned the January 6th deadline, Sonia, for the submission of the electoral votes. Can you walk us through, and anyone, please feel free, but Sonia, if you'd like to continue, what are the dates that we're looking at now? Because right now, none of the state votes are certified, right? They have to be submitted by the federal secretaries of state. And we do have a question that I'm going to elevate from the chat from our colleague, David Jones. What happens at the hand recount in Georgia? And there are expected recounts in Arizona and perhaps Nevada and Wisconsin for certainty as well, if those are not completed by the November 20th deadline. So if you could walk us through the gates, where are we headed over these next few weeks?
Well, to start with, if we're talking about votes across the country, we haven't even received all the overseas votes from military members and those who are living outside of the country. Those won't even be received until this Friday at the earliest. Then we look to the concern over a few states like Alaska hasn't finished its voting. It, I think, is projecting to be done maybe by Saturday. So we haven't even we're a week in, and we still have a couple of states that have not concluded their voting. That we know. But the difference between today and the 2000 election is that we are not talking about 500 votes or even 700 votes, which I think overall was part of that contest. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of votes in terms of at least 7 states. So already the math is not in the same place. Having said that, we now have, by I'd say within 2 weeks, most of the states will be ready to send or conclude their counting and prepare for the next big deadline, which would be December 13th. By this time, the states are supposed to have final counts. If there are any challenges, recounts, those types of things are supposed to happen before then. And then on the 14th of December, we look for the Electoral College process that's supposed to culminate on January 6th. So that's what we have ahead. but let's imagine that there is no transition ongoing during this period of time. And every day matters when we're talking about what are we doing with the pandemic, and how that will affect the ability of the new administration to get up and running.
So, David, if we could just go a little further into that.
Sure.
The legal framework, one of the weaknesses of the foundation is that state law and federal law are both applicable at varying times and in varying ways. The November 20th deadline in Georgia has actually very little impact on the federally governed so-called electoral college counting of votes. In 1883, Congress passed a statute which basically sets up a schedule for the national counting of the electors. There's no electoral college, but there is a schedule by which the electors' votes must be recorded and then transmitted to Congress. And the first part of that schedule is on December 8th. The next part is December 14th. If Georgia wants to push the November 20th state deadline back to November 30th, that's up to the Georgia legislature. They can do that because their obligation is to get the count of their electors into the hands of the federal government on and after December 14. And actually, because of the old Pony Express days, so the law was written, the electors had to be chosen by December 14, so that by January 6th, all those votes would have gotten to Washington by horse. So that's the origin of some of those dates. But that's why we have this process worked out the way we do. But we can come back later to the degree to which federal law interferes with the state process of counting these votes.
Thank you for that clarification. Kathleen, can you say a little bit about these recount operations? You've talked about an already stressed system that's coming to the end of a marathon election season, and in at least 3 and likely more places, they're going to gin that right back up again, and have already done so in one of those jurisdictions. What's the process there? And trying to elevate a couple of questions from chat, is it the case that while those recounts are taking place, that observers have a right to actually see each ballot, to get close enough so that they're able to observe each piece of paper as it passes through the process?
Well, I can talk about it generally in the sense that a system under stress without resources is at some point in danger. One of the most important resources I think we learned about during this election cycle was the resource of time. And we're going to be up against that then. Now, I can say without having any of the specifics at hand, that recounts rarely overturn the result of an election. And I think there are a lot of folks out there saying the same sort of thing. The recount process is handled in a couple of different ways. There's a piece of it that would be handled by hand. And I'm not talking about what Georgia's chosen to do. I'm just saying inside each state they choose. And it has to do with how the ballots come in. And some of it is done by machine, and some of it may be verified again by machine. There are a couple of processes out there. That's what the canvas is about, which is a review of the ballots that is occurring right now, which leads up to certification. There are some new processes, newer processes in motion, one of which I read earlier today, may be in play in Georgia, in addition to the hand count recount, and that is a type of audit, statistically bounded audit. There are a bunch of different varieties of those, and so I can't speak to which one might be chosen, and that's the state's ability to choose what they might want to do. It is the same kind of meticulous check, cross-check, and I think it's important to note that goes on during the election process itself, during the balloting process itself. I think it's important for the audience to know that this isn't just about counting the votes. It's actually about accounting for all the ballots. Not every ballot that's cast can be counted. It might be spoiled, it might have to be remade. voter might be ineligible, right? And so it's a really meticulous accounting process. It's done differently in different states, but it is done in a bipartisan manner. Observers can watch. There are, some, as I mentioned earlier, live streaming things going on right now. Even before live streaming, election offices had extremely transparent processes with giant plate glass windows that, in the old days, you could stand behind those and watch as well, and those are open. I think one of the limitations now that we're going to see is a practical limit based on the size of the facilities that are being used. We saw this, for example, in a garden variety polling place, casting ballots with pandemic guidelines. You just simply can't put as many people in the room. I believe that, from what I've heard, that all of the observer protocols differ around the states, but they all allow observers. Bipartisan observers have been everywhere. The general rule is, close, but not close enough to interfere with the process. And I think we can all appreciate that if we were to think about doing our jobs with a couple people or 5 or 6 or 10 people standing over us, looking at what we're doing and asking us questions while we do it. That resource of time that I mentioned can be disrupted can be disruptive in this process.
Kathleen, can you say a little bit about the security of the ballots themselves? One of our early questions, and one of the questions that just came in on chat, and a word, by the way, to those of you who are waiting for me to ask your question in chat. I'm trying to fold them in when they're relevant in the conversation, and I'll ask them later whether they are or not. So you're not being neglected. But one of the questions is, there's certainly motivation on the part of some observers, perhaps, to tamper with ballots. How are the ballots being protected during this period? Does that vary by locality? Is this election official staff responsibility? Who does that?
This is a local election officials, a local election office's responsibility. They do this very well. Bins of ballots, typically locked with seals that are opened then when ballots are removed to be processed through a tabulator or counted by hand. They're racked and stacked in secure locations, and essentially guarded. The security, and this is not security that's new for this particular election. This is, I think it's important to note that the standard operating procedure for election offices around the country is to be prepared. And be prepared for contingencies, and the security of the ballots is a piece of that. Electronic security, of course, has come light years from 2016. I think all of the experts would agree that the efforts of the federal government and the partnerships between CIS and CISA and DHS and the local offices, the new infrastructure that's emerged that is actually replicates some of the things that were stood up in New York City after 9/11. The partnerships and the work there is tremendous and has made a really big difference. So you have electronic security for things that are counted and managed electronically, and you have physical security that isn't new for any election office. That is, really a 24-hour operation.
Terrific, thank you. Roger, you mentioned earlier your experience in Florida in 2000, which in many respects is the template for stealing an election and for assaulting polling places and counting operations. You called it the Brooks Brothers riot, or the Brooks Brothers terrorists who conducted that campaign on behalf of the George W. Bush campaign. Can you say a little bit, based on your experience there and what you've studied subsequently, what harbingers for 2020 did you see there? What do you think we can expect, either with regard to the behavior of partisan observers or with regard to the law in the days and weeks ahead?
Well, it's a lengthy development, but we'll come to the key parts of it as follows. The Gore v. Bush election was incredibly close, as Sonia mentioned. At one point, Gore and Bush were separated by 537 votes, so that unlike the current situation, literally every vote counted. And I was involved in a case in which we had the opportunity, if successful in challenging some absentee votes, to give Gore 739 more votes, which is obviously greater than 537. So the possibility was that we could, in the courthouse, give Gore the election, everything else being the same, because by that time, most of the other cases had fallen away. So that litigation was fairly intense, and it got shifted from a sympathetic Democratic state court judge to an unsympathetic Republican federal court judge. One should not be surprised, but at least disappointed that the party affiliation of a judge makes a huge difference in these cases, and it does, and it still will, and one cannot be naive about that. I know that the Chief Justice said there are no Bush or Obama judges, but he's wrong, okay? They do exist. The key thing in the Florida case, which is very interesting, is that Florida allowed the ballots of soldiers and sailors overseas to be counted for 10 days after the election, because it takes a while to get a ballot from, a post in Afghanistan back to Florida. Well, Florida allowed that because it had been sued by the federal government. And the federal government said, you're not really giving overseas people a chance to get their ballots in. And the way they handled that was they compromised. They said, okay, up to 10 days after the election. Well, the problem was that the Florida legislature never actually changed the law. So the state court judge said, well, under Florida law, those votes don't count. Federal judge says under federal law, those votes do count. So the voters got, enmeshed in the chainsaw, if you will, or in this litigation issue. Now, probably the good news is that what the court said was the voters are entitled to rely on the regime that was favorable to them, which was allowing their votes to be counted if they came in up to 10 days after the election. So the relevance of that to this situation is as follows. We have cases repeatedly going on after early voting started. So in Houston, for example, the county of Harris County set up a drive-through arrangement. You could drive up to a ballot, lean out your car window, hand in the ballot, and drive forward. Well, the Republicans said that's not a legal voting place, so the voting place has to be a structure. And so, I mean, imagine you think you cast your vote on Tuesday, and the following week someone says you didn't cast your vote in a structure. Okay, so what happens to your vote? Well, fortunately, the way that case came out was there were several reasons why the Republican side lost, but one of the things the judge certainly said was those voters who voted shouldn't have to worry about whether the vote counted or whether they have to go back and vote again. So I think what came out of the Florida case that I thought was favorable was the concept that voters should be able to rely upon the regime that's in place. If I can just go on, there's a certain element of legal history here, which is maybe interesting to some. During the Second World War, the state of Montana passed a statute that said, if you're fighting in the Ruhr, or you're fighting in the Philippines, if you're an American soldier or sailor overseas, your ballot can be counted up until December 31st, even if the election is early in November. Well, that was a problem because that was really late counting of ballots, and the Democrats and Republicans together went to the Montana Supreme Court and said, they coughed and said, well, that's not going to work because the federal government wants our votes by mid-December. So ultimately, the very strict decision, the Montana Supreme Court said, the ballot must arrive at the polling place from overseas through the mails, all the way along by horseback or whatever, until it gets to the polling place and the counters of ballots are deposited in the ballot box. So we've moved a long way from 1944 in terms of the liberality of the law in this area, but it's not fully resolved.
Terrific, thank you. We're getting through that joint study session is something that we'll be returning to as we think about the impact of history on our current processes. Sonia, we have a series of challenges being advanced by the administration. We have a relentless assault on the integrity of the process. We see the partisan divisions in the way that people are understanding that. We're seeing, however, also among people who are inclined to believe that the count was conducted fairly, as we all around the bezel believe tonight, that there are other institutions that are problematic. Alex Wilson in chat points to disturbing videos of police pushing over tables, confiscating items at polling places, and that the suspicion is not of the voting process, but of law enforcement in and around voting. How does that play into this process? And how do we think about the way that this is both covered and supervised outside of election management per se, especially, and I'm going to toss one more log on this fire, the Attorney General's decision to empower U.S. attorneys in real time to investigate on their own allegations of vote fraud.
Okay.
I know that I gave you a big bonfire. So
okay, bonfire. Let me see if I can bring some buckets to the bonfire. Let's start with the Department of Justice. Normally, my answer to your question would be, we would turn to the Department of Justice for assistance to make sure that every voting place was safe, and to make sure that if there had been problems, there were remedies to those solutions. We currently have an Attorney General who has decided that he's not the people's number one attorney, but the president's number one attorney. And after being silent for a couple of days, issued an order that was contrary to Department of Justice rules that says the election division should not be involved in anything until it's clear that the election has been settled. One of the people who received the memo from the Department of Justice from the Attorney General was a 30-year veteran who, if you were to talk to people in the Department of Justice, would tell you was one of the most trustworthy and nonpartisan attorneys on staff. When he received that memo, said, I have to step down because I cannot follow this according to what our practice has been and how this could skew perception of the fairness of the electoral process. So that's number one. Number two, I think it's a function of those in leadership positions, whether at the state level or at the city level, to ensure that peace officers or sheriffs or any other law enforcement officials are not becoming part of the problem as we try and get through the next 60 days. Beyond that, I think it's also a function of how is our media covering these issues? Are they giving good information, or are they very happy to let the bonfire continue to rage? And I would hope that we see more attention addressed to factual reporting as opposed to sensational reporting. But we also have to worry about the disinformation that's going out over social media every day. And people are listening to it and sharing it and becoming fearful because of it. And that helps to keep this anxiety level higher than it should be, given the number of votes that were cast and counted as of today. So I guess my short answer to your question would be that we have to call upon those election officials who, I would argue to this point, have demonstrated that they are willing to do their job. And we should trust them to do that. We can look at the Secretary of State of Georgia, who was attacked by candidates for the US Senate saying, you should step down when he was doing his job. No one suggested that he was doing his job improperly in terms of doing bad things with ballots, but instead he was not engaging in fraud, and they didn't like it and they've attacked him. So we have to trust in part, and this is also related to the fact that our election system is decentralized, and that may help us, as opposed to having one system where the Attorney General could make one order and we have no idea what happened to the ballots. Now, under the Voting Rights Act, there was a provision that would allow, if there were allegations of racial or ethnic discrimination, that the Attorney General could order those ballots in those places seized so that they could be protected. Right now, I'm not sure we would feel comfortable if the Attorney General wanted to seize any ballots, and we have to hope that that's not the next step in terms of resolving the final vote counts in the few states that are still counting.
Do you fear that as a possible outcome?
I fear they're going to use any trick in the book to keep the final resolution unclear, so that the people, whoever they voted for, are not sure what happened. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong.
Okay. Thank you. Kathleen, I think it's time to start pivoting a little bit toward the future and what lessons we learned. You mentioned in your opening remarks that we've learned a lot during this cycle. Can you say a little bit about what we've learned that may prompt some kinds of change? We have a question in the chat from, hold on one second, let me see, my chat is jumping, and you're all doing exactly the right thing, which is asking a lot of questions. From Perry Horowitz, who wants to know why we haven't seen more of a movement for election administration to be nonpartisan as opposed to bipartisan. We had talked earlier today about some calls to nationalize elections as opposed to relying on this 50-state patchwork, which is of course baked into the Constitution itself. Can you say a little bit about what we've learned that can prompt constructive change in your view in the way that we manage elections?
Sure. I think the Roger and Sonia's comments about the flood of litigation gives you a sense of maybe all of the very good ideas or bad ideas that people have out there about how. I do believe that a national system would be flawed. I've written about that, and the security issue is one. The possibility of overwhelming national political influence is another, and I think, and this leads into the other piece here, the thing that we would lose, which I think is what helps keep elections trustable to the extent that we can sort of revive that, is that there's a significant, an overwhelming amount of local expertise. Federal officials don't run elections. Secretaries of state don't run elections. State election directors don't conduct elections. They make policy, right? And we might agree with the policy, we might disagree with the policy, but there's a significant difference between policy that might actually be bad or disenfranchising, and the acts of people on the ground attempting to follow the rules the way they were written. There's always conversation, and I get asked about it a lot, about the role of politics in the election administration process. And so we've got two choices, right? We have three. We have elected folks, right, who are directly elected by the public. And in many other areas of our sort of understanding of democracy, we uphold that as worthy and valuable, because those people are directly connected to voters. And if voters aren't happy with what they've done, they can remove them. They don't need any help to remove them. Voters can remove them. And so in the state of Florida, in the state of Colorado, in other states around the country, election officials are directly elected. Or, and I think this is where it gets a little cloudy and people start to become concerned, they might be appointed by elected officials, right? Well, if they're going to be appointed, let's just all be honest, they're going to be appointed by somebody. And how will that body be constructed in a political system? There will be political influence. And so, the argument about having, and in many states do have a very strong bipartisan appointment and review process for the construction of election offices. That having both parties at the table, historically, I think, at least in the modern era, has worked to keep everybody honest. If what we're going to have is a power struggle, then we should have the people at the table who are able to engage in that. And so I'm not in favor of a national system. I think the decentralized piece serves us very well in a lot of ways, although it's confusing. And the fact that you can do one thing in one state and something else in another state. There may be some things that we really want to examine. Pre-processing would be one of those things that I think is a kind of a neutral idea. And for those in the audience who don't know what I'm talking about the ability, the requirement perhaps, which doesn't exist today, that all states allow opening of mail ballots and counting mail ballots and doing certain things that have to be done procedurally before election day. You're just in a completely different situation if you are looking at a 10 or 15 or 20-fold increase in ballots, and you can't even start opening them until the day that everybody shows up to vote on election day. So I think those kinds of things we might see we might see parties able to reach common ground. I am always an optimist, and so I say all of that, understanding that we would also have a national presence and a national system, if you will, if we had equity. If we had the equity oversight from the Department of Justice that we had until 2013.
Okay. Staying with you for a second, Kathleen, our colleague from Baruch in the journalism program, Gisela Regaton, would like to know if you think that we are going to see a decline in trust in voting as a result of particularly the Trump campaign and administration's attacks on voting. And if you do expect that, what steps can we take on trust? And I'd like to hear from both Sonia and Roger on this point as well, to restore that trust or to build it, again, to use the Joe Biden phrase, to build it back better.
Yeah, that is such a good question. And I have, I've been having conversations with your colleagues in the media about this, most recently about the kerfluffle in Arizona about Sharpiegate, and the idea that using a Sharpie was not okay under the previous election regime, but now it was allowed, and voters were confused, and so their confusion then became mistrust. And we had a long conversation about what to do about that, and I'm concerned that facts don't seem to matter. Providing more facts about a situation doesn't seem to help in the heat of the moment. And so I think, and this may sound like a very simplistic, very Pollyanna attitude, but the people running elections, the supervisors and the administrators standing out on the steps at night, listening, taking questions from the media and reporting results and being heckled, and the counters in the room who have people breathing around them. These are our people. This is our community. This is our local government. These people are us. We need to care about these people. We need to understand that they're not separate from us. That they are our friends, our neighbors. They're doing a job. They're people we go to school with, people we go to church with, and so it's a complicated. It's complicated to me. It seems complicated and simple at the same time. I don't have an answer, but I have faith.
Thank you. Same question, Sonia, Roger, whichever you would like to jump in first. Is this election going to restore, for all the good reasons that we began with at the top of the evening, trust in elections, or is it going to erode it? And if the latter, what do we do about that?
Well,
I could. Go ahead, Sonia.
No, you go ahead. I'll take it last.
Okay. Well, the legal system is not well equipped to restore trust for a couple of reasons. First of all, the legal system expresses its conclusions in judges' opinions that are lengthy and obscure and often very attuned to fine points of the law and are not very easily publicized in a helpful way. We certainly saw that in Bush v. Gore, where there were multiple opinions, and it was very destructive of any kind of trust in the legal system because the Supreme Court judges were very clearly perceived as taking one side. But there's another reason why the legal system won't do a good job here. It's because it's much easier to accuse than to find the truth. Or as a very old saying goes, the lie gets halfway around the world before the truth can get its pants on. It's a very ancient expression. But the legal system is not going to be the mechanism for rebuilding trust. I hope there are others, but it would be naive to think that people bringing lawsuits and lawyers standing on the steps of the courthouse advocating their arguments is a system that really builds trust and confidence in the election system. I wish it was otherwise. I certainly didn't. I would have much higher hopes, but I also have to be realistic.
Thank you, Sonia.
Well, I would build on what both Roger and Kathleen have said to look at what's happened in the recent past from 2000 forward with respect to Bush versus Gore. It could have been a 7-2 opinion rather than a 5-4. And the difference was that those on the liberal side or less conservative side said, let's continue the count. If you do that, we're willing to vote with the majority. So it would have been 7-2. It would not have caused the loss of faith in the Supreme Court that followed Bush versus Gore. Bush versus Gore was, I believe, wrong on a number of different levels, but most importantly, stating that this was a one-time deal, this case can't be used for precedent going forward. But in a few of the recent cases the Supreme Court has heard just this term, we had Justice Kavanaugh suggesting that maybe we need to use Bush versus Gore. And that concerned me. I'm just saying, if it was a one-off, okay, it was a one-off. It didn't resolve the way I thought it should have, but at least it can't be used going forward. And now there's that suggestion that it may. On the flip side, because I try and be fair to the court, our highest court, court ruled in a Washington state case that those people who are electors, who are involved in the electoral college process, must be faithful, must vote for the people they said they were going to vote for. And that was unanimous. That was one of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's last cases. So that may be one of the few things that helps stop the madness of what we're seeing going on right now with the uncertainty that continues. But to that point of trust, I'd also point to the fact that the US Post Office was considered one of our most trustworthy agencies, yet our president went after that agency through his choice of Postmaster General. But even against that background of destroying sorting machines and stopping overtime and not allowing mail to be delivered when it should have been, I think what the US Postal Service did this election season was phenomenal. And we have to make sure that people recognize that we talk about it, that we show that the problem wasn't in lack of delivery of votes, whatever else might have, ballots through the mail, that whatever else might have happened, that was not the problem. That even under duress, the people who worked for the US Postal Service did their best. And I think we have to acknowledge that. But I also saw a question on the chat asking about, well, what about the Help America Vote Act, which followed the 2000 election mess? And I would say that that act is insufficient in its current form. So the question becomes, can we amend it and make it stronger? Well, that depends on what happens in the Georgia runoff elections for the last 2 seats of the Senate. And I would say it's a reminder to us, why does Georgia have that runoff process? Because in the 60s, the state of Georgia said, we need this so that we can stop Black politicians from being elected. So it was one of those Jim Crow era leftovers. And now we're seeing it having an outsized role in what's happening in this current election in terms of control of the Senate. So we have reminders of continuing problems of race in the electoral process, but we also have the results from this current election where we had the highest number of votes cast for the presidency in modern history. So we have to spend our time, those of us who care about the political process, talking about those things. Young voters voted more. The US Post Office did its job. the election officials did their job, and we should maintain our faith that we can have a fair and legal election process.
Okay, thank you. Beyond the election, Ricardo Martinez is concerned about talk that the GOP could block secretaries of state of contested states from certifying results, which could allow legislatures in those states to try to appoint new electors who favor President Trump. How do you fight back to ensure that the Democratic vote is upheld? Who would like to play out the game? There was a Martin Gelman in the Atlantic last 2 months ago, I guess it was now, charted out a series of ways in which Republican legislatures particularly could conceivably seat different slates of electors from Democratic governors in those same states. How do you, is that a remote likelihood? And if somebody tries to take that up, how do you stop it?
I'd be glad to start on that. But maybe we could ask your team to put up the slide of the U.S. Constitution, Article 2, because everything starts there.
Diana, could you put that up, please?
No, there we go. Okay. So, in 1786, the Constitution was written with the idea that the states had a very major role in the election process, and the underlying language at the top, which I just read out loud because it's the best way to absorb it, says that each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors, who are the electors who then are from the state of Pennsylvania or Kentucky or New York, who vote, whether there's 6 or 8 or 10 of them. And the legislatures have generally enacted statutes which say the electors shall vote in accordance with the majority vote in the general election. There's some exceptions, but they're not important. So that the statutes say, as I said, if Pennsylvania has more votes for Biden than for Trump, the electors must vote that way. Well, there's a huge open question here as to what the legislature's powers really are, because there's a general point of view in the Supreme Court that this is a very broad grant of authority to legislatures. And there was a point of view in Florida in the year 2000 when it looked like the courts might give the election to Gore. The Republican legislature in Tallahassee made it very public that they intended to vote in another slate of Republican electors if the courts gave the election to Gore. So that was an unprecedented event then, but as David has said, it's being talked about in a fair amount today. And what this Supreme Court would do about it is a very big open question. I believe it will not come up to the Supreme Court in this election for a number of sort of practical reasons. But it can come up sometime. Let me illustrate an unanswered question. The Pennsylvania legislature specifically said in a law that the electors must vote in accordance with a popular vote. So people have said, okay, that answers the whole question. They'll have to do what they're supposed to do. But what if the legislature changes the law today after the election? What happens then? There's no answer to that question. And if the legislature changes the law, does that require the governor's signature? Well, it normally requires the governor's signature, but it doesn't look like it's required the way the Constitution was written, because it doesn't say anything about the legislature or the governor. It just says the legislature can direct how the electors are to be picked. There are other arguments to be made that this is a one-only process here. It says the states shall appoint the electors in such manner as the legislature may direct. So the legislature directs an election. Well, does it get a second chance? Does it get a second chance to say we don't like that, so we're going to do it a different way? Nobody has an answer to that. So the honest answer is that this is an unresolved area of potentially great significance, but one hopes it will never be reached. You can, on the flip side of this, say that it is hard to imagine Justice Roberts and some of the other justices removing an election from the popular vote because the legislature tried to jump in after the election. It would just be a huge move for the courts to take. And the courts don't like to take huge moves because it tends to discredit their credibility even more than it has been already. So that's a start on this topic. There's much more to be said.
Thank you. Kathleen, Sonia, anything to add on that one?
I'll leave the reading of those tea leaves to people more expert than I am in that. I have to say that I've watched what's going on in Pennsylvania with great concern. It raises new questions, and I'll be watching along with everybody else.
Are your concerns Rogers or
generally it's the only it's the only litigation, sort of the dynamic there is the only legal dynamic that I think has a really long reach, because it's so deep. It's about it's about some of our most fundamental questions. It's about who's in charge. What's the governor allowed to do? What's the Secretary of State, who's in almost every state responsible in some way for election administration broadly? What's the Secretary of State allowed to do? What's the legislature allowed to do? What happens when they disagree? And we saw those things with the pandemic early on in the primary season in March. We saw what happened in Wisconsin. We saw what happened in Ohio. Governor DeWine shut things down, and had the political goodwill behind him to allow that to stand and be done well. Right? In Wisconsin, I'm loose with the facts here, but in Wisconsin, they were litigating how they were going to allow people to vote up until the minute people got in line in the rain. I mean, that's a different way, right? So we don't know. And those questions don't get asked very often, and when they do, they're often asked in really highly politically charged circumstances, which, again, perhaps generally why the court backs away from those.
And that's also a reflection of a state with one party in charge of all branches of government, and a state where that control is divided, with the legislature very much opposed to anything Governor Evers is putting forward in Wisconsin.
Yeah, although for what it's worth, Ohio's local election system at the county level is highly political. Folks are appointed, but they are card-carrying Republicans and Democrats, equal numbers. The local boards have 2 of each. The secretary breaks the tie. It's very politically charged, but no less professional.
Thank you. Sonia, you had mentioned earlier that Pennsylvania is giving you conniptions and keeping you up at night. Anything you care to add to this discussion?
Oh, sure. It's following on Roger's point about the case to be concerned about. That's literally contains the kitchen sink and would give the court, if it decided to throw a wrench into the current process, the ability to do so. Now, I'm not suggesting at this point that's a inevitability. I'm simply saying that if you're telling me it's a possibility, it's making me very nervous. But I also look at the fact that one of the questions I get most from students is, why haven't we reformed the Electoral College or gotten rid of it? Because that's what we're up to right now, dealing with it's not an actual college, but it's a process that has the prospect of going against the wishes of the majority of voters in this current election. So that's concerning. We can look at Bush versus Gore, the case I mentioned earlier, which I said the court said should not be used as a precedent. But if it were used as a precedent, it could say that allowing different ways of handling absentee or mail-in ballots disadvantaged or discriminated against those who voted in person, and therefore we're not going to count those. I know that sounds far-fetched, but believe me, it's being discussed. We also have to look at how best we could move forward, because the case I mentioned, the July case from Washington, suggests that maybe the interstate compact to have states agree that they will follow the majority vote in their states is a way forward. There's also ranked voting as another prospect. It's not one I'm in favor of, but others have said there are other ways to make sure people feel that they're having a voice that's being heard. That's also a factor in however this is resolved. But I think it's still that question of the people have spoken. Will the majority rule hold in this instance? Or will we have another instance where the court intervenes and allows the person who did not receive the majority of the popular vote to take the office? That's where I think we are.
Okay, thank you. And of course, the compact is that agreement among states to seat the winner of the popular vote nationally and cast all of their electoral votes to that end. It triggers when you get to 270 or more participating states. So right now, I believe we're at about 196 electoral votes, if memory serves, right?
Yes.
And as far as ranked choice voting is concerned, for all of you who are New Yorkers listening to this call, we start ranked choice voting in special elections for 2 vacant council seats. And that will come right up in either, it still hasn't been decided when, but either January or February of 2021. Our colleague David Jones asks, can you explain why Bush v. Gore would help Trump? Wouldn't the president say, stop counting and declare the leader to be the winner, and therefore be a help to Biden? I think in the context of the Kavanaugh quotation earlier, Sonia, that one goes to you.
Well, and I understand where the question's coming from. The simplest answer I could make to that is the case itself was incoherent, and therefore you can make it say whatever you want it to say for a new election. And that is why I'm so concerned about any mention of Bush versus Gore during this time period. Doesn't mean I can't tell you, David, automatically we stop the vote. Well, even if we stop the vote counts right now, the assumption would be Biden is the winner. But we also know if they look at other elements, they could say, oh, any votes that were counted after last Tuesday are no longer considered legal. That's what happens when you start unpacking an election process by state, and that's the concern. Okay?
David, we have a slide that illustrates some of the answer to that question. If we can get the slide about the Pennsylvania case put up for a moment.
I think that would be helpful.
Yeah. No, not that one. No.
It's a federal court.
That's the one. Okay. So let me be a little bit didactic for a moment. The Trump people are saying that there are widespread disparities across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in how votes were being counted and how votes were being handled. For example, they say there's a requirement to check the signature of a voter. Well, when you walk up to the voting booth, you sign a little book, the election official there is supposed to see if you have the same signature, more or less at least, as the one in their book. Well, their complaint is that a lot of ballots came in from certain counties like Philadelphia and the Pittsburgh County Allegheny that didn't have their signature checked. And so what they're arguing right down to the bottom says, resulting in the treatment of by mail and in-person voters in an unequal fashion in violation of state and federal constitutional standards. Well, Bush v. Gore was all about unequal methods of assessing voter intent in ballots in Florida in 2000. Now, what Trump people are trying to do here is to jump from what the Bush v. Gore case was about to really saying any disparity is unconstitutional. It violates the Equal Protection Clause. And my forecast is that the Supreme Court's not going to go along with that because it's too big a leap. But the danger exists that this case that you're looking at on the screen is the one that's going to go to the Supreme Court. It's been set up that way. It was filed in the most conservative part of the state of Pennsylvania, in front of one of the more conservative judges, a Republican who happened to have been appointed by Obama. But there is a way to push this case up the federal system quickly to the Supreme Court. I predict the Trump lawyers will try to do that. They have one of their better legal teams handling this case. And one of the ironies of the legal system is if the first judge, the trial level judge, dismisses the case quickly, that allows it to get up to the Supreme Court faster. What he could also do is he could just bury the case in a long, protracted procedure till inauguration day. And one might even hope for that. But that's just an illustration of how poorly the legal system can handle these kinds of issues. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Early in our collection of questions from chat, Amy Harwood, you thought I'd given up on you, Amy. It's not true. Wrote the following. She said, I hope assume that eventually all of the Trump administration's attempts to thwart the transition of the presidency will be squashed, but I'm very concerned about the lack of support or access during the transition period. The 9/11 report found that the delay in presidential briefings due to the Bush-Gore delays may have led to serious breakdowns in information flow. With Trump firing existing defense professionals and hiring people who won't brief the Biden team, what is your level of concern of a repeat of the 2000-2001 transition? Who'd like to jump in on that one first? Kathleen, can we go to you?
Sure. I think I share I share concerns that a chunk of the people in the country share. It's probably not all of them. That, you know, there's a level of professionalism and professionalization in public service that's expected. And we're talking about people who work and execute their public responsibilities at the highest level. And so we've come to expect that there will be, you know, a period of time where people exchange information, particularly sensitive information that couldn't be made, you know, publicly available as a public record, you know, today or yesterday or last year. And so I think by not following a practice that every other president has embraced, I think it's damaging to public trust. I think an ordinary person can imagine, you know, showing up at an office, you know, either seeing nothing in their office and a blank computer screen, or, you know, a whole bunch of boxes and a mess. And obviously that's that's not an actual description, but I think it's something that sits poorly with people when they try to understand what's going on beyond, the political maneuvering.
Thank you. Roger, Sonia, either of you would like to get in on this one?
Sure. I echo those concerns and comments by Kathleen. I would go a little further to talk about what does it mean when we can't expect the norms of government to be followed, and that we've seen the damage that can be done throughout the course of this current administration. But also, to be fair, there's always friction between an incoming and outcoming administration. But this, what we're witnessing now, is beyond that. By refusing to release the funds so that the transition process can go forward, by continuing to have people work on the federal budget that was approved by the Trump administration, to basically cast doubt as to who will be the president-elect and the president as of January 20th, during a time when every day we lose to combating this pandemic means the loss of American lives. So this is not theoretical. This is not a law school exercise. This is a demonstration of the problems and the weaknesses of our current constitutional process. And now I think if we learn nothing else from what we're going through, is that we have some serious work to do so that we can avoid this type of quandary in the future. But I don't see it being resolved easily. I see a lot of concern on the parts of everyday people over what's going to happen next. And those of us who have been following elections for decades, we don't have good answers for them. So it's a question of process, clearly, but it's also a question of who and what elements of our constitutional process can also be used to begin the transition process.
Thank you.
So David, there's just a few non-legal things could be contributed. One is that there's an enormous amount of talent in the Biden operation, and that is a bit of a saving grace. The counterweight is that a lot of the people whom he's interviewing and bringing in know government already, have been involved in government, and while they aren't current on the immediate issues necessarily, they're very able to move ahead quickly if they're there. The other interesting thing is that the transition process starts before Election Day by law. The whole procedure for some of the steps to be taken, even without knowing who's going to be elected. And I don't know how effective that procedure is, but it brings to mind the thought that it might be sensible to move Inauguration Day to an earlier date so that we don't have 71 days of an outgoing lame duck being in a dangerous position, or in a position to cause a lot of danger. I don't know if that change will ever be made. It would require a constitutional amendment, but it would be interesting to think about a shorter transition period.
And of course, we used to install the president, inaugurate the president in March,
right.
Because of the difficulties of transportation in the 18th century. So we have another adjustment we could possibly make. This is, first, before I get on to the next substantive question, I'd like to say that Ari Gershman has let us know that we do in fact have a date for the special, and this is the Landsman seat that has been vacated, and that is for February 2nd. Presumably that same date will be used to fill Richie Torres' seat in the Bronx as he goes off to the U.S. House of Representatives. So thank you for that, Aaron. Gail Fitzer writes, I think we need new laws. I feel we need new laws and systems to protect democracy. Trump has proven our democracy is not strong enough to withstand an autocrat who will do anything to hold on to power, especially when his party backs him up. Democratic norms are clearly not enough. Do you have any ideas about what can be done to protect our democracy? And I think we may close on this question. I'd like to hear from all of you. And let me just amplify that a little bit. We've heard from scholars, including the 175 or so who signed a letter last Sunday talking about the peril to democracy right now. But from Levitsky and Ziblatt, Yasha Monk, and others, that it is precisely these norms that it's weak-paced, but it is nonetheless the bond that we have. Laws work. What can we do to strengthen this, apart from applauding and continuing to support the efforts of our local election officials? And Kathleen, why don't I begin with you?
Sure. Well, and I'll respond as an educator and someone who works closely with hundreds of election officials around the country. My education piece, I think, has to do with our community understanding of what civic responsibility is. There have been an awful lot of initiatives over the last 20 years labeled civic engagement, civic responsibility, put civic in front of any noun you want, and that's sort of the flavor of the day. I think there's a real need for us to, if I could repackage it, we need a STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. We need a STEM for politics. The things that people don't understand about this system and that provoke desire to become involved and provoke desire for change. I think thinking about those things is really important. And so I think using this election as a real teaching moment, and I realize that's an overused phrase, but the students that I have in my classes, they don't know anything about Bush v. Gore. They weren't around. It wasn't part of it's not part of their framework. And so I think thinking systematically about how to handle better the public education responsibility that's a part of our system is, I know it's something that I'm going to be a part of.
Terrific. I'm glad that you're going to be a part of it, and I couldn't agree more on the necessity. Roger, what do we do?
Well, again, sticking within the boundaries of the profession that I work in, the law, I think the National Popular Vote Compact that was alluded to earlier would be the most fundamentally significant step we could take in terms of moving toward a democratic approach, because the electoral college system is decidedly undemocratic. It gives enormous voting weight to a small slice of the country population-wise. It can't be changed because it's in the Constitution, and amending the Constitution requires 3/4 of the states to vote in favor of amendment, and the smaller states have no reason to give up the electoral college because they would lose their whatever say they have, whatever power they have in the election process. So the resolution or the remedy is this act that has been discussed already, which very briefly says, no matter how people vote in your state, disregard that. If there's a national majority in favor of a particular candidate, your state's electors will be casting their votes in the electoral college system for that candidate. In fact, it's a democratizing overlay to the existing electoral college system. And I think if people around the country felt that there wasn't some arbitrary, obscure process that determined who the president is, they would be more comfortable with democracy. Every 4 years we see this come to light. And so that's a reason to focus on that.
Thank you. Sonia, you get the last word on this.
Wow. Okay, I'm scared now, but I'll see what I can do. I agree with the comments by my colleagues on this panel. It's not an easy fix. I look at the fact that the current Senate Majority Leader has had 10 years to block the Democratic president's choice of judges and accelerate the current president's selection of judges to the federal bench, thereby skewing what had been a relative balance in terms of party affiliation on the federal judiciary. And then we add to that what happened in the wake of the death of Justice Ginsburg. I am not someone who believes in throwing fire on a burning building, but I think we have to look seriously at trying to restore some balance at the Supreme Court level, if nowhere else. And that means adding to the number of seats on the court. Now, that didn't work in the 30s, and I'm not saying it would work now, but you're asking us to think outside of the box in terms of how to think seriously about restoring norms so that we don't have an automatic guess at which way the court is going to rule on matters that deeply divide Americans, whether it's gun control, whether it's climate control, whether it's abortion, or any of the other major social issues that continue to divide our nation. But against that backdrop, I also have to remember that if we are able to ask Americans, what do you think is most important for us to address, there's actually more agreement than disagreement. Sure, we have divisions, but on the important issues of being able to take care of your family, being able to have a good job, having health care. Oh, well, maybe the Affordable Care Act will survive this term, but I'm not sure yet. But it's how do we do this in a way that, first, to build on Kathleen's point, make sure our students know how, not just our college students, but our K through 12 students understand how this process is supposed to work. And we ask our media not to hype unfounded, unsupported claims of fraud when we could prove fraud if it existed, and that would be a justification for making changes. But too often, everyone's taking a seat back and waiting to see who else is going to solve this, and we have to see if the people are ready to do that.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for a tremendous discussion. Before I offer my formal words of thanks, let me just let everybody here know about two events. One I'm putting in chat right now. I think I'm putting it in chat. Yes. Tomorrow night, you can hear from 4 of our CUNY colleagues, including David Jones, who has participated in this conversation. You can see him on screen. Up at the CUNY Grad Center, nominally, the aftermath, looking at what we've learned from this election more broadly. There's David waving at you from the screen. Thanks very much. And I've put in there the Zoom link so you can hit the registration. Please do before you leave here. And the other thing that I wanted to call your attention to, did that in fact go to everybody? Now it's out to everybody. Okay, so you see the link there, and please do sign up. I also wanted to give you a link to an event that we are hosting next week in the Mark School, and that is coming to you here. And Diana, if you could put the link in there as well, that would be terrific.
I just sent it. Yeah. I just sent it.
Thank you. Voting rights, vote suppression, race and perceptual divides in the 2020 election. The guest speaker is the New York Times' Tom Edsall, who has also spent many decades of distinguished journalism with the Washington Post, and we hope to see you all there. Kathleen Hale, Roger Bernstein, Sonia Jarvis, you've shared some terrific insights. You've given me some hope that we'll get through this and that we have institutions that will survive these next 70 days, and we'll see what we're able to do in healing this country in the years beyond. Thank you very much for being here this evening. For everybody else who's joined us this evening, thank you. I see many, many familiar faces and names. We're not done yet. When this is all over, like really over, we're going to take a long view at what the next administration will be up to in terms of its policy agendas, and that will wrap us up for this election cycle before what we hope will be a joyous inauguration watch on January 20th. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening and stay safe.